They are the closest to the Sanatanis in terms of their origins and their spiritual ethics and mores. But today, they have drifted so far away that they are a completely foreign entity to the Sanatanis. They are the closest in terms of the origin of their language to the Sanatanis and to Sanskrit. But today, the two kindreds cannot understand one another's ways of speech. They are the closest in terms of their ancient worldviews and respect towards nature, and yet today, Sanatanis and they do not look eye to eye on most topics of religion and civilization. They are the Iranians or the Iranic peoples. In today's episode, we will be seeing some scriptural as well as historical sources on the origins of the Iranic peoples and how Sanatana Dharma itself looks at these groups of peoples. What we need to understand is that when I say Iranians, I'm not referring to the citizens of the country known as Iran today, but a wider set of ethnicities and race groups that speak related languages which today are classified as Iranic languages. The Iranian peoples originated rather obscurely from the point of view of Sanatana Dharma, and the very first time they came into prominence in history was during the time of the Median Empire and the time of the Achaemenid Empire. But even before these empires came into prominence, we see that in the Ramayana and in the Mahabharata there are numerous mentions of two particular tribes, the Shakas, and the Kambhoja. In Iranian, you have the Saka, in various Iranian sources such as Ferdowsi, or in various Greek sources such as Ctesias and Herodotus, you have mention of the people known as Saka being referred again and again. And in Emperor Darius's Behistun inscription, the word Saka keeps coming up. And of course, when taken in tandem with Mahabharata and Ramayana, we come across Shakas, Daradas, Barbaras, Paplavas, Kambhojas, inhabiting the regions that are inhabited today and in ancient times by Iranic peoples. And we often wonder, are these people related? Now, in this map, I have made a note of where the Saka peoples were located within the Iranian Achaemenid Empire. But even before we go into the origins of the Iranic peoples, let me just give you a small summary of the three prominent eras in which the Iranic peoples rose to historical prominence. The first one was during the time of the Achaemenid Empire, when Zoroastrianism was a state religion and many client states coalesced into an empire under Cyrus the Great and then under Emperor Darius the First and the Achaemenid dynasty. They ruled most of West Asia and all of Central Asia and a large chunk of Western Bharatavarsha as well. They were succeeded by the Parthian Empire, which was created by the same Sakas we saw. When Alexander destroyed the Achaemenid Empire and his generals and their successors began ruling the various Greek states that ruled over the remains of the destroyed Achaemenid Empire, the Saka tribes from Central Asia, they burst into Iran and they destroyed the Greek rule over there, and they established what we know as the Parthian Empire, a time when the Zoroastrian civilization of Iran reached a certain level of fruition. And of course, this empire was internally overthrown by a Persian dynasty known as the Sasanian dynasty, and they established what we know as the Sassanid Empire, the largest ever empire that the Iranians have created outside of the Achaemenid Empire. And this empire is significant in history for one primary reason, the reason being that it set the social format and the cultural format for what would later become the Islamic world, right? From dressing habits to eating habits to ways of speech to societal morality to marriage laws to criminal laws to administrative structures to legal systems to currency systems and economic systems. This empire, the Sassanid Empire, established the format that would later be followed by the Arab caliphates and by the various Turkish empires that would rule the entirety of the Islamic Middle East. Thus, all the Islamic culture we see today actually comes from this empire, the Sassanid Empire. Now that we have seen an overview of how the Iranian peoples came to prominence, we need to know where they originated from. Like I already mentioned, Mahabharata and Ramayana mentioned some of their tribes, but we need to see also some non-scriptural historical sources to see how many of those sources speak of the same people, the same tribes. The Sakas are some of the oldest and most ruthless of the Mleccha races. Not only do Mahabharata and Ramayana call them extremely fierce and vile and vicious warriors, but even the Greek chroniclers of the ancient times, they called them as some of the worst pillagers and robbers of the ancient world. This group of people are actually very mysterious, and we know very little bit about them. We know mostly from the Greek writings of these people, from Strabo and from Ctesias and from Herodotus, and they say that they are mysterious semi-nomadic wanderers from interior Eurasia who rode horses, were extremely great horse archers. They wore pointy hats on their head. They wore very light scaled armor in combat, and they spoke a strange language that only they understood, and their kings were never united but rather kept fighting with everyone. They were a very disturbed society that kept brutally fighting amongst itself and with the rest of the Greek world. And in fact, there was a time, Ctesias says across his book, and so does Strabo say across his book, The Geography of the World, that the various Shaka tribes pillaged and ravaged the Greco-Iranian world, that is the Pontic Steppe, Central Asia. They burned down entire cities, and this went on for many centuries. In fact, it was a century where from Eurasia these terrible people would come. They would raid and they would indulge in slave trading and kidnapping and rapine, and they would just disappear far beyond into the Eurasian steppe, only to reappear again and go. The first empire to come into conflict with them was the Achaemenid Empire, and this empire of settled Iranic peoples, we see they were in a state of constant war with the Saka, and when they subjugated a large number of Saka, in the course of time, Alexander and his armies destroyed the Achaemenid Empire, and the Saka were again free to do as they pleased. And when the Greeks took over the Iranian Empire, they realized the horror that they had unleashed on themselves. They had let the Saka free, and the Saka again started raiding and ravaging most of the Caucasus and Central Asia. And finally, they drove the Greeks out and established the Parthian Empire, which we already saw. Now, not much is known about the Saka. We just know from some writings of especially Herodotus and of Ctesias and Strabo that these people were in fact some kind of nature worshippers. They followed similar deities that we find in Zoroastrianism, such as Mitra, Anahita, Atar, Apamnapat. These are all various Zoroastrian angelic figures whom these people also must have worshipped as deities, but we do not know much more about them. Another group of people we come across, the Kambhoja. Now, about the Kambhoja, we know a little more from scripture. The Kambhoja, unlike the Saka, are not mentioned much in foreign sources. Most of the mention, or in fact I can say all of their mentions, come from Ramayana and Mahabharata, and they inhabited lands north of Kashmir, west of Kashmir, and they are described as a mixture of ex-Kshatriyas who rule across the northwestern Himalayas and the foothills of the Himalayas, and a mixture of them as well as Mlecchas form this group of people known as the Kambhojas. The Kambhojas live amidst various other people, including the Cholas. So we see in the Mahabharata that at one time Chola princes also ruled fiefdoms in the Himalayas alongside these Kambhoja princes, and Nakula as well as Arjuna defeated them. But when we go into some non-scriptural sources, the only places we see Kambhojas mentioned seriously are Ashoka's inscriptions. Now we see very particularly that Ashoka in his time says that in the Junagadh region of Gujarat, the place where Gujarat borders with Pakistan today, in the Dehradun area of Uttarakhand, and in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where Pakistan and Afghanistan border, Kambhojas are prevalent people over here, and they are mentioned in large numbers over here, which means that these are also the same places that Arjuna and Nakula fought with the Kambhojas and subjugated them. And right down to Ashoka's time, we are able to see in Ashoka's own rock edicts that the Kambhojas lived in these places. Now, if you want to know about what kind of religious beliefs these people had, that is a little clearer in a book known as Fihrist, written by an Islamic era chronicler known as Al-Nadim. Al-Nadim lived in the 9th century in the Abbasid Empire, and he wrote of the lands where the Kambhojas lived that these are a people who follow various gods such as Chandra, Surya, Mahakala, and he says that Mahakala is a god that wears bones and is something like a death god. And we know as Hindus today that Mahakala is a form of Shiva himself. He also goes on to say that a lot of their idols, which are located around the Bamiyan area, are worshipped alongside idols of Buddha, and that these idols are often four-handed and they are made of sapphire, and they are known to have miraculous healing powers, and people from all over India come to these idols, and these idols are worshipped by Brahmanas, he says. Al-Nadim himself uses the word Brahman, and he also says that people from here, also from these lands, that is from central Afghanistan and southern Afghanistan and eastern Afghanistan, the places where the Kambhojas live, they also journey to a distant river in the east known as Ganga to take a holy dip over there. So we see that the Kambhojas were kind of like a bridge civilization between Sanatani civilization and the Iranic world, and they followed elements of both civilizations. We know from the Kushan inscriptions, and we know from Kanishka's coins and from Kanishka's Rabatak inscription in Kandahar that these Kambhojas, when they lived under the Kushans, they followed a bit of Zoroastrianism, they followed a bit of Buddhism, and they followed a bit of Sanatana dharmic deities like Shiva and Ganapati. We also have archaeological proof that an elephant-headed god was worshipped around the Kabul area, and we know from Mahmud of Ghazni's biographer Ferishta, from the Ferishta Nama, that around the Kabul area, which was ruled by various Janjua Rajputs, these gods were also very famous over there. So we get an idea that the Kambhojas had one foot in the Indic world and one foot in the newly evolving Iranian world, even as recently back as 1,100 years ago. And a lot of these Kambhojas, in fact, with admixture of the Iranian people, form the ancestors of the Pashtus today, the Pashtus who today are followers of Sunni Islam. So we see that this is kind of how we see that the ancient Mleccha races that are mentioned in the Ramayana and Mahabharata have somehow, through a period of time, evolved into these Iranic and semi-Sanatani Indic races of people, and they mixed once more with one another. And on the eve of Islam, they were following a syncretic religion that was a little bit Iranic, was a little bit Buddhist, and a little bit, it had elements of Sanatana Dharma, such as worship of Shiva, etc. And then, of course, we all know that when Islam took over these lands and the Arabs took over these lands, most of these religions were completely destroyed and abandoned. Now, when we look at these peoples in the Zoroastrian scriptures, in the Gathas, we only see one name that is familiar. Again, there is a group of people known as the Daha that are mentioned as one of the four primordial people in the world to whom Zoroastrianism was given. And who are these Daha? When we explore who these Daha are, and when we compare them with what Strabo says about the Daha, we notice that Strabo uses the word Daha, the Greek chronicler Strabo uses the word Daha to refer to the same Sakas we saw so far, and that the Zoroastrian Avesta also uses the word Daha to refer to a group of inner Asian, Eurasian nomadic tribes who are supposed to be very ferocious warriors. We see that right in the Zoroastrian ancient days, these Shakas, whom Mahabharata and Ramayana called as very fierce warriors who rose from Vasishtha's cow, were very much active in Inner Asia, and there was a serious attempt by Zarathustra himself to convert them to Zoroastrianism. Alexander's successors for some time tried to subjugate them, and then they themselves got subjugated completely by them. And these people, true to what is said about them in Ramayana and Mahabharata, were extremely ferocious warriors and extremely ruthless warriors and cunning strategists. They were some of the worst nightmares of the Greek rulers of the ancient world. So we see that Sanatani scripture as well as Iranian scriptures, Zoroastrian scriptures, are painting a clearer image now that somewhere the Iranians also come from the same sources from where the Vedantic texts say the Mlecchas come from. They are also alluding that they are from very, very similar origins. We can divide the Iranian world into two parts, the pre-Zoroastrian world and the post-Zoroastrian world. The pre-Zoroastrian world is similar to the world that Arjuna and Nakula saw during their conquest of the northern Himalayas and the northwestern trans-Himalayan region, and the parts that were way away from the Himalayas towards the western desert lands of Bharatavarsha and beyond. The pre-Zoroastrian Iranic world, as documented by Greeks as well as documented by later on Iranian chroniclers themselves, it paints a very vivid picture that it was a very tribal society. It was not a unified society. It was a society of semi-nomadism and perennial warring, and there was a lot of disunity among these people, and they did not even follow a unified religion. They followed various local cults. And if we come to think about it, these cults, if you look at the details of what the cult's beliefs were, it will be very similar to certain beliefs that we have in Sanatana Dharma. For example, the names of their gods, they worship deities like Haoma, which is very, very similar to the Vedic deity Soma. They worship the sun by the name of Mitra, and Brahmanas even today during Sandhya Vandana, they call the sun as Mitra. Of course, Brahmanas call the Antaryami of the sun, Sriman Narayana, as Mitra, whereas they call Mitra as a manifestation of their Almighty, Ahura Mazda. While there were similarities in the way in which pre-Zoroastrian Iranians lived and they spoke and they worshipped, most of them were a disunited lot, whereas when Zarathustra came and introduced his religion, most of the Iranian world, although was never united truly ever under a single emperor, they did develop a common sense of shared kinship under the banner of Zoroastrianism. So in the Achaemenid imperial period was the one time when the Iranians were closest to being unified under one ruler, and even then they were not, because the Sakas were largely independent. The Parthian Empire was a time when a lot of Iranians were under one banner, and the Sassanid Empire was the second and last time in history when all the Iranians came very close to uniting under one banner. But in the post-Zoroastrian world, we see that the Iranians rejected all forms of idol worship and in fact even violently opposed it. In an inscription written in the Naqsh Rustam in a location known as the Kambhojas, we see that the Iranian high priest of the Sassanid Empire under Shahanshah Vahraman, Shahanshah Shapur, the Iranian high priest Kartar Hangirpe, he in fact writes on the Kambhojas inscription that he instituted the persecution of Manichaeans, Buddhists, Christians and Brahmanas within the Sassanid Empire. Reason? They worshipped idols and they did not venerate the holy fire. So we see that although the Iranian world was often very pluralistic in its religious approach and they were not religious fanatics, there were periods of time in the Sassanid imperial era when the Iranians violently did impose Zoroastrianism even on Sanatanis. He openly itself says that I punished the Brahmanas and I broke their areas, their altars of worship where they worship demons, and I lit holy fires of Zoroastrianism in there. There was a feeling of a one people under one God and a mission to unite the world under this one banner. And in fact, most Zoroastrian rulers under the Sassanid Empire saw it as their holy mission to spread Zoroastrianism to other parts of the world, although they did not take that role very seriously. They More history teaches us that Sassanid emperors more defended Iran rather than bearing the banner of Zoroastrianism by force to other places. But we do see that the Iranian identity, the Iranian dress code, the Iranian culture as such, which later became the culture of the Arab caliphates and the various Turkic Islamic empires, was formed during Sassanid Empire's era under the stewardship of the Zoroastrian religion, and that most Zoroastrian ethics, norms, and cultural family values are found even today in the Iranian world within an Islamic fabric. They do not they stopped worshipping any form of idols and they started worshipping a non-idol based way of looking at an almighty entity. Now, that being said, Zoroastrians retained a lot of Sanatani Vedantic values, primarily worship of the sun as a manifestation of the Almighty and worship of the cow. The cow is a holy animal in Zoroastrianism, and in the Sassanid imperial times, persecution of ill treatment of dogs and cows was banned by law, and there was a kingdom in the southern coast of the Caspian Sea, a Sassanid client state ruled by a cadet branch of Sassanid imperial princes, whose emperors, whose kings called themselves as Gavbari. Gavbari was a title that they took upon themselves, the kings of Mazandaran. It literally means cow worshipper. In those lands, you could not harm cows in any way. And even today, in the few Zoroastrian fire temples that are there in Iran and in India, you will see a white bull or a cow present in those temples whose milk and whose urine is used as part of their holy offerings to their sacred fire, which is very similar to what Sanatanis do. We also offer milk and cow dung to the holy yajna fire. There has always been a very strong emphasis on vegetarianism in Zoroastrianism. In fact, the great Sassanid Zoroastrian high priest, Adurpat Meheres Pandan, he wrote in his writings that a civilized man would eat only vegetables and he would shun meat. And even today, Zoroastrian high priests, wherever the few who are left in this world today, they still follow a staunchly vegetarian diet. And as we shall see, it was a common belief across the Iranian world before the coming of Islam that it was the devil who convinced man to start eating meat, whereas man in his most natural state is a vegetarian, which is what Sanatanis believe, that Vaivasvata Manu is actually a vegetarian and he intended all humans to be vegetarians, but it is our own inner evil, our own rajasic and tamasic natures that make us eat meat. We now will come to where what Ferdowsi, some of the things that Ferdowsi has written in Shahnameh about the pre-Islamic beliefs, the cultural beliefs of the Iranians, and then one such primary belief was an emphasis on vegetarianism. And he says that it was commonly believed around the Iranian world that a demonic ruler known as Ajdahaka, who appears in the Zoroastrian sacred texts as Ajoish Dahaka, as a monstrous tyrannical ruler possessed by demonic forces who started introducing meat eating to humans. And Iranians believe that humans in their most natural state were in fact vegetarians. And this is very reflective of their kindred, the Vedic people, the Vaidikas, who also believe the exact same thing to this very day. Another very striking remnant of pre-Islamic days of Iran can be seen in the northern Kurdish region, the part that where Iran borders with Turkey today, where the Dimili people, the Zazagorani people, the Zazagorani Kurdish people today inhabit. In the language of the Dimili people, the word for God is Haum, which is basically derived from the Iranian Zoroastrian word for the deity Hauma, which is the Zoroastrian version of the Vedic Soma, a deity that is invoked during the crushing of the Hauma plant and offering it to the sacred Zoroastrian fire. And that deity is supposed to be a manifestation of Ahura Mazda's power. And even today, the Zazagorani Kurds of eastern Turkey and northwestern Iran use this word to refer to Almighty God. And lastly, the last great Sassanid emperor, Khusrau II, famously said, according to Dinavari and Ferdowsi, that he would never stop fighting against the heathen Christian Eastern Roman Emperor Heraclius until Heraclius renounced Christianity and the nailed cross god Jesus Christ and would bow his head down to the true Almighty in the image of the sun. Showcasing once again that Iranians took the worship of the sun very seriously and saw it as a direct manifestation of their Almighty Ahura Mazda, something which Brahmanas do even today when they do Sandhya Vandana thrice a day. So before we conclude, we see ancient Iranic peoples from Vedic sources, and we see how their behavior and their belief systems and their culture morphed into the more recent Iranian peoples whom we see in various non-scriptural historical sources like the Persians, the Pakhtuns, the Parthians, the Sogdians, the Kalasha, the Kurds, etc. Some of these people are extinct today. The Parthians are extinct, the Sogdians are extinct, the Kalasha are almost extinct. The Daylamites, they are what we call as the Dimili today, whom I just mentioned 5 minutes back. And of course the Khwarezmians are also completely extinct. We can be left with no doubt that it is these people mentioned in ancient Sanatani scriptures as Mlecchas and Avarnas who were created by one, a part of their ancestors rose from Vasishta's cow. Another group of their ancestors come from fallen Kshatriyas and Shudra rulers of various fringes of Bharatavarsha. How these two groups intermarried and created the Mleccha races we know today. And it is the dominance of these Mleccha races around the world today that make the Indo-European language stream come to prominence and give rise to something known as the Indo-European people. I will be making a separate video on the Sanatani Vedic view towards Indo-European language stream and what the Sanatani, the Vedic view towards the Indo-European languages are. Because no such view today is officially accepted, but I feel it's important for us to put forth our view also on that matter. I'll be making a separate video, but now we have laid the basis of how the Indo-European language stream actually forms. It comes because various Avarna races have carried dilute versions of Sanskrit to various parts of the world where they have grown over time into totally alien languages. With that, my basis for my next episode will be set the Sanatani view towards the Indo-European race groups and languages. As always, we conclude by saying that we can be left with no doubt that the Iranians are some of the oldest and most ancient Avarna groups. Avestan is closest language to Sanskrit, is the closest Avarna Mleccha language to Sanskrit. In fact, I will recite the most common Zoroastrian prayer, the Ahunavar, and you can see for yourself how much it sounds like Sanskrit. The prayer goes like this: Yatha ahuvairyo atharatush ashati chita hachavanghe yush dasda manango shyauthanana mangye yush mazdai kshatram cha ahuraya yim dregabyo datat vastaram. It pretty much sounds like Sanskrit, and a scholar of Sanskrit would be able to decode about 70% of what that even means. It's their most commonly recited prayer to keep away evil forces in the religion of Zoroastrianism, and it is recited usually seeing the sun or the fire as a manifestation of their almighty god Ahura Mazda. As always, we conclude again by saying that these people, although are outside of Sanatana Dharma, they went that way because of their karma takes them farther and farther away from Sanatani beliefs, and it is the inherent gunas of the people that make them not to believe in Varnashrama, not to believe in Sriman Narayana, not to believe in staunch vegetarianism, not to believe in a Satvika way of life, not to believe in Yajna, and they became nomads and they lost a sense of nationhood and purpose, and they drifted away from their Sanatani brothers over a period of time. But do they have hope? Of course they do. Every creature has hope, because fundamentally they may belong to a different race, but their soul is very much like our soul. They may have taken a different body like us, but the soul within is of similar quality. It is Jnana Swarupa, and when its karma phala is void, it will gravitate and just go off and fly off to Vaikuntha and be with Sriman Narayana forever. Their body type is just a temporary body type. The soul within is every bit like the soul within us and the soul within any other being. They are also Jivatmans, and when they perish, they also take on another life, as do we. And life after life, they are given chances, like any other Jivatman, to move closer and closer to Sriman Narayana, and eventually Souls that are born as Mlecchas, you must remember, would have at one point of time been Sanatanis. And souls which are being born as Mlecchas today can be reborn as Sanatanis tomorrow. So before we judge anyone too harshly, look at the individual person's gunas and judge them as individuals. Their societies might have tendencies to behave in certain adharmic ways, but at an individual level, their individual morality still does count, and it still carries punya in the eyes of Sriman Narayana. That being said, again, as usual, shout out to Dakshin Vrindavan for doing such a great job of protecting cows, and do your bit towards Go Seva today and get in touch with Dakshin Vrindavan. And I urge all of you to do your duty always towards the race of cows, because whatever happens, Dharma is never going to die and Dharma is eternal. And whichever race group rules over you today or does not rule over you today, service to Dharma is always eternal. Srimate Narayana Namo Namaha.